marriage. Marriage is what brings us together today.
In the fullness of time, we all die. We cannot change that. However, we can, over the course of our lives, change to some degree some of the circumstances of those lives before we leave this mortal coil. If you had to choose, how would you prefer to die? Surrounded by family, friends, children, and grandchildren, or alone after slipping in the bath, breaking your hip, and probably being eaten by your own many pet cats?
I've fallen, and I can't get up!
Well, now that I've gotten you into the spirit of things, pun intended, with some very pleasant imagery to consider, let me ask you another question. Is it possible to die happy, but alone? A recent article from Guardian writer Kelly Goff contends it's not only possible, but that data confirm there is joy in living and dying alone, and that this is potentially some bad news for that perpetual patriarchy we live in. But is any of that true? Certainly the possibility of ending up alone has been on an upward trend for several decades now in the United States, as Pew data indicate that in the 1960s only 8% of women and 10% of men had never been married. But by 2012, those numbers had risen to 17% of women and 22% of men having ignored the I do's. Predictive modeling of this trend also suggests that for adults aged 34 to 43 in the current year, nearly a quarter of them will never have been married by the year 2030. This increasing portion of the population means that regardless of whether or not there is joy in dying alone, it will certainly become an increasingly common phenomena in the coming decades. Thus, we do need to look at the data to see if there really is solace in singleness. What exactly then does the research indicate about life, death, marriage, happiness, satisfaction, health, and well-being? But before we get into the nitty-gritty of mortality, there's something that comes first, your life as it stands, and it's hard to live an easy, happy, and free life when the Chinese government is constantly trying to censor your freedom of speech. Luckily, you can fight back against the tyranny of outside governmental influences and maintain your access to a free internet by checking out Nord VPN. Nord is my personal choice in virtual private networks because it allows me to connect to over 5,200 servers from 62 countries and counting, which, by the way, includes China. Free Hong Kong, democracy now. Because they don't log any data, you can surf the web and shitpost to your heart's content risk-free, and more importantly, you can check the service out similarly risk-free by signing up for a 30-day money-back free trial by clicking the link in my description and downloading Nord not just to your PC, but to your mobile devices or laptop, and protect your security online, which is particularly important when connecting to public Wi-Fi. If you like the service, you can get 75% off a 3-year plan with NordVPN and continue to protect your privacy, safety, and security online with the VPN consistently rated best in the business by sites like VPN Mentor. So,
Try it out, man.
Don't like it? Don't buy it. And speaking of buying the cow when you can get the milk for free, let's move into talking about marriage, satisfaction, and happiness. To start, let's address Kelly Goff's basic claim. Is there joy in dying alone? No, there isn't. At least not compared to being married when we look at statistical averages. There we go. Video over, I guess. Yeah, right. As if I'd let you all off the hook that easily. No. We have to go into the data. Real deep into the data. Simply put, though, there's a metric buttload of studies, and that is a technical term, that have shown that married people are just happier than singles. But for simplicity's sake, let's check out this Pew data. However, immediately, we are posed with a perpetual problem of correlation not equating to causation. What came first, the chicken or the egg? Or alternatively, what didn't come first? Are incels and femcells single because they are unhappy, socially anxious, and dissatisfied with their lives? Or are they unhappy, socially anxious, and dissatisfied with their lives because they are single? In short, is the persistently higher happiness presented by married people a result of them just being naturally happier and more satisfied, meaning there's nothing about singleness that produces unhappiness inherent, but rather only that unhappy people just tend to not get married? Thus, there's nothing preventing happiness in those who choose to remain single. Well, luckily, I think we can answer that question again with some delicious data. A new study from Grover and Halliwell, 2019, analyzed longitudinal data from the British Household Panel Survey and the United Kingdom Annual Population Survey to better understand how marriage affects life satisfaction in a causal direction rather than a mere correlational relationship. As expected, they found that married people reported greater satisfaction, but also that people who were generally more satisfied before marriage tended to be more likely to get married in the future. They were 1.37 times more likely to get married precisely. Additionally, people who were unmarried 8 or more years ago at the start of data collection only had a 22% chance of being married after 10 years. That means, yes, more satisfied people are in fact more likely to get married, and people who have been unmarried for a long time are unlikely to marry in the future. So there we go. Question answered. Married people are only happier because happier people are the ones that get married, right? Hang on, that's still just a correlation. Without taking previous life satisfaction into consideration, being married produced more satisfaction than living together with a partner to a significant degree, as expected. However, when the researchers included previous life satisfaction, not only was more current satisfaction accounted for in the total model fit, meaning they were able to more thoroughly explain satisfaction with life, but consistently, marriage remained one of the strongest predicting variables of life satisfaction at present when taking previous life satisfaction into account. Although the power of marriage on predicting happiness was reduced when taking this previous satisfaction into consideration, it still remained a dominant predictor. That means that marriage increases life satisfaction regardless of how satisfied one is before marriage. And while more satisfied people may be more likely to wed, their pre-existing happiness does not explain the difference in satisfaction between the single and the married. The researchers also wanted to see how satisfaction changed over time, as after all, life isn't a perpetual honeymoon, and at some point surely some of that initial magic fades, or at least the flames of passion burn a little bit lower, right? Well, the data do, in fact, seem to indicate that, at least to a degree. People reported the most satisfaction within 3 years of being married, as we could expect from the honeymoon effect, and the satisfaction gradually decreased over time, falling to around the same level as pre-marriage satisfaction when having been married for 7 years or longer. But because the magic fades, does that really mean it's just better to avoid marriage altogether? Well, the data don't seem to provide good support for that supposition, for as we can see consistently, people who have been married at any point in their lives have significantly higher satisfaction reports than people who have never been married, until they reach over the age of 86, at which point the never married just barely eke out and surpass the married in terms of satisfaction. Although the standard deviation scores are quite wide here, meaning there's a lot of variation in reported satisfaction across subjects. There's also a lot of potential explanations for that finding. For example, it's possible that mortality plays a big role in the leveling off of satisfaction later in life, as if you're not married and never have been, well, your non-extant spouse can't pass away. Surely something that negatively affects the happiness of the elderly, just a guess.
There are a lot of ways to grieve, but last time I checked, wheelbarrow style wasn't one of them.
Moreover, what this means in relationship to the finding that satisfaction decreases over time is that total life satisfaction just generally goes down steadily across both the never and the ever married between the ages of 25 and 55, before in both groups rising again as people enter their 60s and up. That is, people are just less satisfied with life in middle age, but become more satisfied as they enter their aptly named golden years. Interestingly, during middle age, the years wherein satisfaction is the lowest for both groups, is also the age where there is the greatest difference in satisfaction between the ever and never married. And specifically, marriage had a much stronger effect on satisfaction in women during these years than in men. This means, though, that people who have been married for more than 7 years are usually just older, and although when taking previous life satisfaction into account in the model, age was non-significant in predicting current satisfaction, health limitations actually had a far greater negative effect on life satisfaction than marriage had as a positive effect. Therefore, it's not age itself so much as health problems, which we know increase with age, that could potentially be responsible for the decrease in satisfaction we see in those married for more than 7 years. That is, if you've been married for the better half of a decade, you're probably in your 30s, if not older, and unlike when you were in your 20s, you probably have a couple more aches and pains than you did when you were a spring chicken, and your life satisfaction is just generally lower, whether you got married or not 10 years prior. But on average, just having been married at all, ever, at any point, seems to produce generally happier, more satisfied people across the entire human lifespan, and we know that this is so regardless of how happy people were before marriage. So thus far, there is not much here to support the idea that dying alone is a joy for men or for women, but there is one thing that actually might give a little credence to it. At least in that not all marriages are created equal, and some will produce more satisfaction than others. While it seems that getting married at some point just produces more satisfied people unilaterally, there are some cases wherein certainly it does more harm than good, such as in the case of abusive relationships, or interestingly, just not being best friends with your partner.
He's my closest friend, and to not even suspect.
Well, it seems to me that the best relationships, the ones that last, are frequently the ones that are rooted in friendship.
While controlling for previous life satisfaction, married people were about as happy as people who just cohabitated with their partner when their partner was also their bestie. In fact, being married to anyone but your best friend produced lower satisfaction than living with someone who was not your best friend. And in the context of the Guardian article, the impact of being married to one's best friend was uniquely influential for women. Of course, all four circumstances, being married to a best friend or cohabitating with a best friend or someone else, all still produced more satisfaction than being single. So, still not to support the joys of dying alone, Kelly Goff, but this does indicate that there is a definitive social aspect involved in why marriage makes us happier and more satisfied, because being with people we like and having a social support system is critical to human society and well-being. There are plenty of analogs we can look to that show similar effects of the positive benefits of socialization. For example, another variable that research consistently finds makes people happier is religion. Is that because religion inherently creates satisfaction? Well, Lemon Putnam 2010 seemed to indicate it does not. As well, they found that religious people of various Christian denominations and Jews all reported higher life satisfaction. Religiosity alone explained almost no variance in how satisfied they were. When researchers added friendships into the equation, however, suddenly more than half of the variance in total life satisfaction was accounted for by holding religious beliefs. And that rose to 60% when taking into account both the strength of the religious beliefs and friendships within the congregation or religious community. Specifically, people with 11 or more friends in their religious organization who reported religion as important to their lives were more than twice as likely to report being extremely satisfied with their lives than those who had no friends in the religious organization. What this means is that social support is strongly related to life satisfaction, and in the case of marriage, as with a religion, being married to your best friend is likely a part of the reason why marriage is so consistently related to greater reports of happiness across the human lifespan. It is important to note, however, that singles are actually more sociable than married couples, likely to compensate for their lack of a long-term partner, as we can see in data from Sarkeesian. Oh, no, God, no, absolutely not that one. This one's name's Natalia, and Grestel 2016, who found that single men and women tended to socialize more with friends, neighbors, and family than did married men and women, as well as both give and receive more social support from these groups of people. This means that singles aren't inherently socially isolate. In fact, they're much more integrated into society than married people. But that still doesn't really change the overall satisfaction gap, and instead implies that these relationships are at best a poor substitute for the long-term romantic partnership that marriage entails, particularly when it's with one's best friend. But so far, we've only looked at general statistics and averages, and just as no two marriages are the same, we're all individuals and no two people are the same. Special snowflakes and all that. And after all, it might be for some people that marriage really is not beneficial based on personality differences. So are there any other variables that might actually make being single and dying alone preferable for some people? Kislev 2018 proposed that holding individualistic and post-materialist values, such as seeking fun, freedom, creativity, and having a desire to try new things, may make people happier while remaining single, and found, yes, post-materialist values increased happiness in people who were never married, widowed, or divorced. Holding these values had no significant effect in those who were married or cohabitating in contrast. For example, the average divorced person's value of seeking fun increased their relative reported happiness by 15%. In the never married, valuing fun produced an increase of relative happiness by 27%. Every post-materialist value measured in this study was associated with higher gains in happiness for every group of singles, with the exception of freedom producing no significant gain for the divorced. So, there we have it. If you are strongly individualistic, then singles can be just as happy as those who are married.
You gonna marry her? Garth, marriage is punishment for shoplifting in some countries.
Except no, that's actually not what this means at all. Sorry, I kind of clickbaited you there. Is it clickbaiting if I do it this far into the video? Never mind. Anyway, I said relative happiness for a reason, because as we can see here from the regression analysis, what fun-seeking, freedom, creativity, and a desire to try new things does for singles is not make them happier or even as happy as those who are married or cohabitating, but rather reduces that gap in happiness that we see again and again across the countless studies. These values instead are more of a bulwark that lessens the gap's severity, but even then, I'm afraid that for the audience Kelly Goff is likely writing to, the growing number of women in their 30s who feel lonely and miserable, fearing being forever alone, sometimes resulting in these women resorting to the unthinkable, ending their own lives out of fear of that loneliness and anxiety, they are the very audience that is probably least likely to hold the values that seem to provide something of a bastion against the inherent decreased happiness we see in singles. Let me explain. Singles, on average, score higher on all four of the individualistic traits than married people do, but often lower than those who cohabitate, who scored highest in all of the four values. The difference in mean scores on these values between the married and the single, however, are all fairly minor, with the largest gap being between 0.17 and 0.19 points on valuing freedom in the divorced and the never married, respectively, to the married. Some variables that did differ to a wider margin were feeling discriminated against, which was highest in the divorced and the never married, and household income, which was highest in the cohabiting and the married. Why this all matters is because when we look at individual coefficients, feeling discriminated against was negatively related to all of the values except for fun seeking. Greater household income was related to higher scores in all 4 variables and values as well, and moreover, all values except for trying new things were significantly negatively related to being female. That's because women tend to be less individualistic and more group-oriented. Thus, the likelihood that a single woman who typically makes less money as a single earner and feels perpetually discriminated against, as likely most of the women reading this Guardian article do, will actually end up holding these values to a degree that would have an effect on her happiness, even to the small percentage that it does in reducing that satisfaction gap, is lower than it is in a single man in being slightly more satisfied and happy with his life as a result of holding those values. That's right, and let me clarify, the people who are more likely to reap any benefits from holding these values, these traits in reducing the happiness gap, are not 30-year-old career women who are angry about the pink tax and the wage gap, yet also that there are no economically viable male partners floating around, but rather male NEETs who live in their mom's basement and play a lot of D&D and video games with other people online. Seriously, the most powerful positive predictors for post-materialist values were unemployment, social activity, having a higher family income, and being male.
It doesn't matter what she looks like. This will be great for Abed.
It will?
Aren't you excited about talking to her?
I wasn't planning on it.
What?
Well, I guess scratch that one off the list of evidence for the joys of women dying single, and speaking of which, now that we've seen marriage does make us happier and more satisfied, even when taking previous life satisfaction and personality variables into account, let's get back to the article itself, and why Ms. Goff posits such a claim in her headline. As we've now seen, being unemployed actually increased the likelihood of holding individualistic values, the kind of values that guard against the inherently lower levels of satisfaction and happiness consistently reported by singles in the data. Yet excelling in one's career is one of the major reasons that Kelly Goff contends there is joy in living and dying alone. Paraphrasing feminist scholar Linda Hirschman cited in this Guardian article, being married, unless to an exceptional man, is a bad bargain for women, forcing them to choose between having a successful career or having a family, or maintaining a career but taking time away from it to have children, which Goff laments results in a large part to the wage gap between male and female employees. It's interesting she would cite the study here that she does, from Clevin Landis and Sogard 2018, because while it does indicate there is a wage gap, and there is, it's not one derived from discrimination or patriarchy, but instead their data show that given our current economic system that requires both partners' work in comparison to the days of yore that Kelly looks back on in disdain, when half of the population wasn't expected to have a full-time desk job writing, illuminating articles for dying media outlets like The Guardian, excuse me. But because Ms. Goff has chosen to cite this particular study, and while I could find plenty of other sources of similar data, I'm only going to use this one to support my point because that's just so much more fun. Is this what the kids call a flex? As we see in cross-country data from the US, UK, Denmark, and Sweden, the wage gap, which, let's be real, does exist, has not only majorly coalesced in increased parity between the sexes over the past decades, it has done so in such a way that everyone earns less, hence a need for both partners to work. Additionally, this is not just a drop in earnings but also in hours worked and participation, and a slight decline in wage rates for all workers. Of course, what the main subject of this particular article is concerned with is the motherhood penalty, which is that directly following the birth of their first child, women's earnings dropped by nearly 40% and continued to lag behind men, remaining about 20% behind them over the next 20 years. Men's income tends to increase regardless of whether or not they have children, but for women, foregoing children places them on a similar economic wage earning track as men. And this is true both in the top 10% and the bottom 10 percentile of earners.
They told me that if I didn't come back today, they were gonna fire me.
What? No, that's illegal. I'm gonna have the labor department down here so fast they won't even...
All right, calm down, Norma Ray.
Now, I don't know if you guys know this, it's a little bit shocking, but taking care of children is kind of a major full-time job. Haven't you seen those articles where women suggest they should be paid hundreds of thousands of dollars a year for raising their own kids? So it's not a surprise that after having children, women's hours working tank and their earnings tank along with it. The result is that as women and men's earnings have both dropped dramatically toward a lowered mean, now means that the effect of having children is the single largest individual factor in the residual wage gap, making up over 80% of the differences in total wages earned, and ultimately, no duh, Men can't get pregnant, give birth, and nurse infants, despite what you may have been led to believe. Although, there is always the possibility of mistakes into miracles. The result is, though, that women with children under school age are much more likely to not work at all, and work part-time once their children are in school. This means fewer hours worked, which means continually depressed earnings. It is not until children have left the home that women tend to go back to working full-time. And let's be clear, in the current year plus 5, that's not 16 or 18 years later. No, it's closer to 30. Eurostat data indicate that the average age at which children leave the parental home as of 2017 was 25 across all EU countries. In the US, the number of young adults up to age 34 currently living with their parents has reached a peak of nearly 32%, previously unseen since the Great Depression. Assuming parents only have one child and not several, it's still at least 18 years before women begin to work full-time after having their first child, and even then, they still tend to work 10% fewer hours than men, so their wages continue to be depressed. But wait a minute, if women and men both need to work full-time, how can families even afford to have children if we are discriminating so much against women by, they themselves choosing to work less or not at all, and instead do the far less important job of raising their progeny?
8 months is not that much time. Soldiers with PTSD are given longer.
Are you comparing yourself to a war hero?
No, of course not. Childbirth is way harder.
Having children then must destroy a family's finances and probably their happiness and satisfaction then, right? Well, no. After having a child, men who tend to continue working full-time see their probability of becoming a manager doubling over the following 10 years. A similar finding can be seen in a 2016 report from the Trade Union Congress, which found that fathers by age 42 make an average of 21% more than non-fathers at the same age. It seems then that having children doesn't inherently destroy the capacity for families to be financially stable, and women can continue to work. They simply don't, at least not at the same number of hours as their husbands up to 20 years after having a child. It's no wonder then why businesses tend to think that women are less committed to a job when they have kids, because they are, and the data show us that's accurate.
I wanted to come back to work. Not everybody needs some long, luxurious Parisian maternity leave.
The trade-off is that men who have kids are given more advantages and priority to support the family and allow mothers to work less at a career and more with their children, as can be illustrated further in data from Carell, Bernard, and Pike 2007, who showed identical resumes to undergrad students, so take that into account when considering the general applicability of these data, and asked them to consider the qualifications of an applicant for a mid-level managerial position. The resumes were identical, differing only by gender and parental status. While mothers were viewed as less committed and competent and subsequently recommended lower salaries and promotions, fathers were seen as significantly more competent, more deserving of promotion and hiring, and ultimately were recommended an average of $6,000 more per annum in salary than non-fathers and $4,000 more than non-mothers. So knowing all of this, it doesn't mean that women can't be mothers from a financial point of view. Does it take time and detract from your career? Well, yeah, of course it does. But now the real question becomes, if it's not financially crippling, provided women remain in a relationship with the father of their children, who will financially benefit from fatherhood to compensate for her working part-time or not at all, is it worth it emotionally, rather than just economically, to marry and have children? So let's look more at motherhood, marriage, and happiness. Traditionally, the purpose of marriage is in large part for the purpose of propagation, so we need to understand how children affect the happiness and satisfaction gaps that we see between the single and the married. Kari 2010 found, as we should expect, that married people were happier in general, but when they tossed children into the mix, metaphorically of course, not physically, the increase in satisfaction was more or less unchanged, neither increased nor decreased. His data indicated that when a woman got married, she gained between 0.18 and 0.21 greater life satisfaction compared to her life satisfaction while single, regardless of whether or not she had kids. Miss Goff contends that not having children or a partner allows women to trade in the traditional so-called second shift that married women often have, having to split her time between child-rearing, household chores, and her job, and that avoiding marriage and children altogether allows women to work on themselves and arguably be happier. But is there any evidence that singlehood allows women more me time and therefore grants them greater capacity for self-fulfillment? Well, according to Kari's data, marriage was between 2 to 3 times more influential on increasing happiness than employment was, and persisted to produce happiness ratings that were 1 to 2 times higher than when previously single, even after the honeymoon period subsided, regardless of whether or not the participant had children. To further understand the potential effects of the supposedly deleterious multiple shifts that women must perform, be it wife, mother, and worker, on happiness, we can look to a study from Perigcello, Hutchison, and Hopefinger, 2008, which assessed the parental relationship and occupational roles of Swiss women. They found single women expressed a similar amount of discrepancy between the amount of time they spent on themselves as did double-track women, that is, women who performed second shift roles as mothers, homemakers, and professionals. Singles only felt slightly less dissatisfied with the amount of me time that they had than single mothers did, and were significantly more dissatisfied than stay-at-home moms and wives with their amount of personal time. In contrast, single women felt that they were spending far too much of their time on their work and expressed a desire to instead spend that time, even more so than on themselves, with a romantic partner. Rather than being happy with having more me time, single women had the greatest disparity between their desired roles and their actual ones, aligning only 77% with their ideal, compared to 89% in women who performed multiple roles as mother, wife, and employee. Double-track women, homemakers, and even single mothers were all generally far more satisfied with their roles than single women were, and this manifested in well-being outcomes as well. Unsurprisingly, single motherhood is stressful, and single mothers reported abysmal physical and psychological health, as well as more financial and relationship dissatisfaction than women of any other social role. However, single women also reported the same deficits in satisfaction regarding all of those health and financial variables, similarly to single mothers, while homemakers and double-track women reported high levels of satisfaction across all areas. Just goes to show, not every housewife is Betty Draper.
What is wrong with you?
It's worth noting, though, that children alone were not related to psychological well-being, but happiness with her partner, her various social roles, and her subjective physical health all explained 25% of the variance in mental well-being across all women. So let's take a moment to talk just a little bit more about the role of children. Similar results regarding children and mental health can be found in Jeffries and Connor, 2002, who found no relationship between child status and depression or psychological well-being in women over the age of 45, while they found that women who chose not to have children actually had the lowest levels of incongruity between their ideal self and their actual self, meaning their roles matched up well with what they wanted to be doing, particularly those in older age. These women also had the lowest levels of ideals for themselves. They had the lowest standards. It's not difficult to have greater congruity between your ideal and your actual when your ideal bar is set so low. Interestingly, involuntarily childless women expressed fewer regrets about not having kids than voluntarily childless women, with a total of 6 regrets related to offspring versus 9 regrets respectively. While mothers expressed the greatest amount of regrets, they all pertained to frustrations about the timing of their pregnancies, a desire to spend more time with their kids, or to simply have more children. That is, the women who had the most regrets about not having kids were not those who were incapable, but those who chose not to. And women who do have kids only regret not having more. Generally, it seems having children is more or less harmless to overall well-being, although, as Henson 2012 illustrated using data from 94 countries, having children can depress life satisfaction in some circumstances, particularly when people have kids at a very young age or during the years directly after their children are born. Although there is a massive boost to life satisfaction immediately around the time of birth, both before and after, it declines around 2 years later. Well, they don't call it the terrible twos for nothing, I guess.
What are you doing?
Making chocolate pudding.
It's 4 o'clock in the morning. Why on earth are you making chocolate pudding?
Because I've lost control of my life.
However, paternal status begins to improve life satisfaction in people over the ages of 55, and significantly so in those over the age of 65. This dip in satisfaction is also absent in people with more affluent financial situations who only experience a total increase in satisfaction after the birth of children. Matsiek, Mencarini, and Vignoli, 2016, similarly found a temporary increase in satisfaction after the birth of the first 2 children for men and women, with a decrease in satisfaction back to pre-pregnancy levels until around age 7, at which point it rises again, particularly for parents with less work-life conflict, but with no boost occurring after the birth of the 3rd child. I guess it sort of becomes normal at that point.
Oh, get that, would you, Deirdre?
As for happiness, a nearly identical trend can be observed in a sample of German and British participants as assessed by Miskelia and Margolis, in that happiness soars directly before, during, and after the pregnancy, and then returns to pre-pregnancy levels, increasing again around 7 years after the birth. However, these data also show us the specific importance of marriage on this trend in happiness and parenthood, at least in the British sample, in that participants were much happier in general, and experienced a greater postpartum increase in happiness when they were married, while single parents lacked the same positive effects of happiness over time. Thus, while there may be some negative effects on well-being for mothers, Marriage seems to serve as a parapet against any problems parenthood presents. And also, the tax breaks don't hurt. Finally, there can be personality differences that make parenthood less stressful for some and more stressful for others. Mowgli, Mencarini, and Rapalini 2015 found that women high in agreeableness had higher subjective well-being after the birth of their first and third child, and for men, after the birth of their first and second. So no, having kids alone won't make you more happy or satisfied intrinsically, but the single life does not produce the kind of psychological boon to mental health from an increased amount of available me time either, as suggested in this Guardian article. So if having children isn't injurious to happiness, what about not having children and regrets that occur as we age, which we've seen that the voluntarily childless do have? Lewis and Borders, in a somewhat dated study from 1995 on divorced and never married childless women between the ages of 35 and 65, found that having regrets had a negative effect and that regrets were the third most potent variable in explaining 65% of variance in total life satisfaction, falling behind job satisfaction and sexual satisfaction respectively. Although interestingly, 45% of this sample reported absolutely no sexual activity whatsoever. Why do you think tumble dryers are so common when clotheslines are so cheap? Most of the women expressed some regrets, however, only 3 of the 152 women interviewed reported extreme regrets about their lives, all of whom had never been married. Both divorced and never married women reported a lack of savings as their #1 regret, with a lack of children being the 3rd most common regret in divorced childless women, and 11th for the never married. If the benefit of foregoing marriage and children is having more time to spend on herself or her career, why would it be that the 3rd most reported regret for never married women was spending too much time on work, and the 6th being not spending enough time on herself, with the 7th also being not spending more time with her friends?
I'm sitting home with my cat, ordering the same thing almost every night. The only thing that can make it sadder is if I had a Kathy comic taped to my refrigerator door.
The big takeaway here is that women who do have severe regrets tend to also be those who have never been married and are childless, and some of their top sources of frustration with their life circumstances were spending too much time at work and not enough time on themselves. These regrets can also cause a decrease in life satisfaction, as more recent data from Hansen, Slagsvold, and Malm 2010 found in their sample of Norwegian adults between the ages of 40 and 80 that childless women and women who had never married, on average, were less satisfied, more depressed, had lower self-esteem, and were more lonely than married women and mothers. Ultimately, children may make some people happier in some instances, but particularly so if they are married, and it seems that those who choose not to have children tend to have more regrets and generally have decreased subjective well-being, not even being satisfied with their increased capacity for me time. And because it seems that it's not just psychological health that's affected here, but also physical health, let's take a closer look at the effect of marriage on physical well-being. The crux of this Guardian article's claims of there being joy in dying alone seems to rest in a study from Kutab et al., and woo, there's a lot of et als in this, 2017, who followed women scientifically, of course, not in a creepy way, although maybe, I see some male names in this list of co-authors. Now, I don't want to assume their gender, but if they do identify as male, obviously, we can assume they're all creeps. Anyway, as our Guardian and apparently Emmy-nominated writer reports, contrary to decades of prevailing wisdom that those who marry are better off, women who stay single or who divorce are actually healthier than those who stay married. Of course, far be it from me to think that maybe, just maybe, someone who writes for The Guardian and some Netflix show about Roe v. Wade might not have the mental acuity to actually read a scientific study. No, far be it from me. But just to make sure the claims are accurate, let's read it together. Or, well, I'll read it and then explain what the numbers mean. Just for you guys, of course. I'm sure Miss Goff understands this research quite thoroughly. Because the truth is, she's not totally wrong. Over a 3-year period, while women's diastolic blood pressure, the tension between heartbeats, decreased regardless of their marital status, it was lowest in women who remained unmarried. And in contrast, the systolic blood pressure, the tension being measured during heartbeats, increased in women who married and decreased in those who stayed single. Moreover, women who walked down the aisle also tended to walk less, having a higher BMI and engaging in less physical activity than the unmarried. Those who got hitched also apparently developed a taste for the hooch, consuming more drinks per day after their wedding. Wow, so it seems that getting married isn't good for physical health. So what about divorce? The data get even more interesting here, as women who divorced had significantly lower blood pressure, both systolic and diastolic, after ending their marriage than those who married or remarried. Similarly to those who wed during the time period assessed, those who stayed married experienced an increase in BMI and waist size, as well as a decrease in physical activity over time, while those who got divorced lost weight, ate healthier, and exercised more. Case closed then, right? Getting married and staying married is bad for your health, hence the joys of living and dying alone. Except there's just a teensy tiny little detail that you forgot to mention in your sentence-long description of this study, Miss Goff, and I'm sorry to point it out and bring your journalistic integrity into question here, but you probably should have included that this study was conducted on freaking postmenopausal women and was collected between 1993 and 1998. Now, I'll be the first to say that old data don't bad data make, although medicine certainly has changed just a little bit in the last 25 years, and society, particularly when it concerns marriage and divorce trends, as we have seen, has definitively changed considerably since the time of data collection. Still, that's not where I really take umbrage here, because the researchers are obviously open about their sample. What Kelly was not open about, however, is that these data only apply to post-menopausal women, not 30-year-old career women who report they want to get married but can't find a man who meets their standards. I'm also now going to point out the things that you sure as hell didn't, Miss Goff, not like you read this study, and I know you didn't read it. Sorry, I can't play this game anymore. Look, I know you didn't. Do you want to know how I know you didn't? Because to get to the study, first I was sent to a write-up on a Psychology Today article, which is a stain on humanity just because it facilitates people like Miss Goff in doing shoddy journalism by reading an abstract of an abstract written for laypeople, often while excluding the most important, albeit often less sensational, findings, if they include any data at all, and then from there, still not to the journal, no. The Psychology Today piece takes me to a press release from the University of Arizona, and it's only from there that I got the actual journal and the data themselves. I see this all the time, and the next time you come across a news article that says something to the extent of, Study X claims such and such, I implore you, click the link. Does it go to the journal page or to another newspaper or publication? If it's the latter, I can pretty much guarantee you the author did not read the study. They read, maybe even just skimmed, the reporting of another so-called journalist. This is a really seriously dangerous game of telephone that journalists are playing with scientific data, because to take the study and say that it implies all women who don't marry or who get divorced are healthier than those who get or stay married is an appalling misrepresentation, and I would say a reckless reporting of scientific facts presented in that study, not only because you neglected this was a study of postmenopausal women, because you didn't freaking read it, you inept dingus, but because the data are far more complicated. Sometimes a thing to pay attention to in research, and this is why Netflix writers should not be reporting on it without a background in science, is not the data reported, but rather the data not reported. In this case, the researchers used a linear regression model to show us what changed in the variables of blood pressure, BMI, waist size, eating, exercise habits, and alcohol consumption. But do you know what they didn't include in their regression, although they did include it in their basic reporting of the demographic data? Things like mental health, family income, and smoking behavior. Why would they do that? Maybe because it wouldn't make the findings, as Kelly stated, contrary to decades of prevailing wisdom. Really having a big thunk here. Because I don't have the data to run the regression myself, I'm forced to compare means, which is suboptimal, but I think you'll find the data filtered out paint a little bit of a different picture from the one that short, and as we've already seen, at best reductive descriptions of the research implies. For example then, the percentage of women whose family income exceeded $70,000 doubled when they married, from 5% in those who remained single to 10% in those who wed. 29% of singles earned under $20,000 compared to 21% of married women earning below that line. While there were little changes in income for women who divorced in the upper echelons of earning, likely due in large part to alimony, the percentage of women earning under $20,000 nearly doubled, from 6% in those who remained married to 11% in those who divorced. I'm not saying that money can buy happiness, let alone love, but it's a pretty nice thing to have.
Marrying money can have its perils. 10 or 15 years down the line, after you've adapted to a lifestyle now totally beyond your means, you can find yourself cast aside, a hollow husk, penniless and crushed.
Data from Fitchers, Hygenson-Deneau, and Shields 2004, who assessed German people in the years following the fall of the Berlin Wall through 2001, found that as the population average income rose, so too did their reported life satisfaction. Although I should mention in that study, marriage was very slightly negatively related to satisfaction in women, but it had nothing on the effect income had on overall satisfaction for both of the sexes. The average person doesn't have the time, nor the insatiable autism and pedantry, to not only click through the 4 times it takes to actually end up at the journal article, nobody got time for that, but then to also read this kind of thing and read it with the kind of critical eye that it takes to notice, for example, that it's kind of weird the researchers bothered to include alcohol consumption in their regression analysis because the basic demographic characteristics looks like it increases in women who get married, but didn't include smoking because it seems to increase in women who become divorced. Specifically, women who got divorced were nearly twice as likely to be current smokers than those who remained married. They also scored lower on reports of emotional well-being, social functioning, and social support, as well as scored higher on ratings of depression. While getting married had neither positive nor negative psychosocial effects on women who wed later in life, they were slightly higher on social functioning and social support than those who remained unmarried. These variables, the specific ones that don't show positive results for divorced and never married women, were left out of the regression. This so concerned me that I actually contacted Dr. Kubar for comment, but as of the time of this recording, she has not yet responded to my request for clarification, nor with the raw data I requested, such that I could run the regressions myself. Again, really makes me think. Getting more into the data on marriage and health, there appear to be sex differences in how positive the effects of marriage are between men and women. As for example, a look at Schneider et al. 2014 found that men who had been divorced or who were single were more likely to be depressed, as were divorced women. However, currently remarried women and divorced women also reported more depression than those who had never been married, indicating that remarriage does not have the same positive effects on well-being that marriage typically forwards. However, the married were again still far happier.
How many husbands have you had?
Mine or other women's?
Yours.
5.
5.
Yes, just the 5. Husband should be like Kleenex, soft, strong, and disposable.
In terms of physical strength, never married men and women in the study were both found to have the lowest grip strength of any group, which is a bit surprising since you'd think the never married men would have some pretty iron grippage, but then again, a woman's body typically weighs a little bit more than your dipstick, so married people are stronger and less depressed. But more importantly, one of the most well-studied effects of marriage on health is in regards to mortality. For example, Randall et al. 2011 conducted a massive regression analysis of 20 to 40,000 US households between the mid-1980s through 1999 and found that both men and women over the age of 25 were less likely to die in the next year when they were married, but that this effect was particularly potent in men. Precisely, unmarried men's odds of dying in the next year are 2.4 times higher than the odds for married men at age 25, falling to 1.7 times higher at age 50 and 1.24 times higher at age 75. For unmarried women, in contrast to married women, the corresponding odds are 1.73 at age 25, 1.38 at age 50, and 1.09 at age 75. Marriage, we can see, relates to living longer. So not only is there no joy in living and dying alone, you're more likely to die early, when alone. And with all of this in mind, and having torn most of these claims apart, let's look at the final claim this article makes. Miskoff notes how single status has not only become more common because, well, we saw that it has, but that it is also no longer stigmatized as it once was. If this is true, and single status is stigmatized, why would people, both men and women, willingly choose to be single? A recent study from Leiker, Price, and Swigert 2019 revealed perhaps one of the major reasons women, at least, are shying away from marriage and sparked some controversy online, as headlines covering the study proclaimed it was evidence that there is a dearth of single men who earn similar salaries to unmarried women looking for a husband. The controversies arose because Tim Pool had the brazen audacity to have standards, saying he would rather not marry a woman who earned and worked as much as he did, and inciting the rage of women who, I guess, wanted him to marry them. That's some pretty tsundere I mean, I get it, Becca Lewis, the beanie is irresistible. But even more irresistible, and perhaps one of the reasons Tim's statements made these women so incensed, is because Tim works hard and makes good money. And as we're about to see, one of the reasons so many women are single and never married today is in large part because they can't find a sugar daddy, because there simply aren't enough pools of men to go around. You could say that the pool's closed.
That's like when your grandma would be like, we'd all go play jacks down at the soda fountain. You're like, no one knows what you're talking about, you idiot. You know how you talk to your grandma?
Women want to marry up. They want to marry into stable financial positions, as Pew data indicate that the number one thing single women look for in a potential mate is a steady job, and that the pool of men who make an acceptable salary has decreased over time, leaving them with fewer prospects. Leiker et al.'s summary statistics support this, illustrating out of the gate an income disparity between unmarried American men and women between the ages of 25 and 45. The researchers developed synthetic spouses based on the average differences between education and earnings in men and women in the same age bracket for the single women. In other words, they developed a hypothetical husband based on the average characteristics of the husbands of their married friends. They found that real single men failed in almost every category to live up to the standards of single women, being 18% less likely to have a college degree, 34% less likely to be employed, 67% less likely to be in the labor force at all, and making 43% less average income than desired. The largest difference occurs in the distribution of men making the expected salaries that women wanted, which affects different races and age groups almost evenly. This means that based on the expectations and norms that they witness in their married friends and family, women are significantly less likely to find a spouse who could meet those standards. And as the researchers further explicate, more and more modern women looking for a partner to whom she can marry up toward are going to have a particularly tough time finding Mr. Right, given they are now more educated and often older when they start seeking marriage.
To be honest, I've never been so scared. But at least I have a husband.
For example, college-educated women in this study are less likely to find a matching partner the older she is, such that a 10% increase in age among women with a college degree was associated with a 25% point decrease in the likelihood of finding a suitable match. We don't just have to look at this theoretical model either, we can see these changes in the actual demographic data as well, looking at Keon 2018, who assessed how many US women married up, married matched, or married down between 1980 and the early 2010s. They found that the percentage of husbands who were more educated than their wives declined from 24% in 1980 to 15% in 2008 to 2012. While on average, husbands continually tended to make more than their wives, both in 1980 and more recently, the share of couples in which the husband made more than his wife declined, and the share of couples wherein the wife made more than her husband increased. This means that, over time, women who prefer hypergamy, marrying up both in terms of education and wealth, are forced now to marry switched or even marry down, at least in terms of education, particularly as women have become the majority of the highly educated populace. As a result, the importance of income hypergamy has potentially replaced desires for total hypergamy both across education and income, with 93% of women who were more educated than their husbands choosing to marry a higher earning man, which is 2 to 3 times as many women with similar education backgrounds as their spouse requiring their partner to earn more. However, the percentage of married women with more education who actually did end up marrying up shrank over time, with 70% of the highly educated women marrying up financially in 1980 compared to only 52% in the 2010s. For women with less education, their likelihood of marrying up decreased only from 78% to 72%. What all of this means is that women continually want to find a man they can marry up toward. However, more and more seem to just be avoiding marriage because there simply aren't enough men who earn more and are more educated. And this makes sense as women have become more educated and begun to earn more themselves. As of 2018, and continually on the rise since the 1980s, women are significantly more likely to have completed a bachelor degree than men, according to Pew data, although apparently they are less likely to complete a bachelor. Further, a 2018 report from the Council of Graduate Schools indicated that women earned 59% of all graduate degrees and 53.4% of doctoral degrees that year. Overall, for every 100 men enrolled in advanced degree programs, there were 137 women. As the gender pay gap has decreased, and not accounting for any of the many variables responsible for it, reaching 89% parity among US young adults under 34 according to 2019 Pew data, there are more women making more money and being more educated than ever before. Therefore, it is no surprise these women can't find men to marry up to. Previously, they could accept some homogamy or even hypogamy of equal or lesser educational backgrounds in exchange for the hypergamy of more income. But now that women make more and hold the majority of college degrees and even advanced degrees, there simply aren't enough men to go around that would constitute a suitable hypergamic match. Thus women work, they finish their degrees, all while waiting for their knight in shining armor. Yet for every degree earned, for every raise gained, for each year that ticks by, the likelihood of finding the one diminishes rapidly.
I did the math. How many times does a woman meet Mr. Right? I've had 3 chances. Floyd, then Carol, and I was once in an elevator with Tom Brokaw, and I blew all 3. Opportunities.
As such, it's no surprise that we see so many articles, not only those like Kelly Goff celebrating women for not being able to find a suitable partner, but countless others. Women lamenting, where have all the good men gone? Suffering from depression and loneliness as time goes on and voluntary singledom becomes involuntary, as their remaining avenues dry up, and so do they. As above, so below. We can find countless articles from women unhappy with their singleness, and far more mocking men who aren't able to find a date. So it's not uncommon to view single status as a symbol of loneliness. Yet it seems that people don't really look down on others for being single inherently, at least when they're young, but rather that much of this is self-imposed frustration with not meeting expectations or for simply just being lonely. We can see this in the attempt to develop an instrument to measure the concept of singleism, that's prejudice against single people, from Pignotti and Abel, 2009, who found that of their sample of undergraduates and a few grad students they used to develop the scale, 3/4 were either neutral or did not endorse the stereotypes about single people, and there was no relationship between opinions towards singleness or feminism and liberal views. That is, other people don't really look down on you for being single, at least at a young age. Instead, much of this stigma is internalized, it's self-hatred. Morris and Osborne 2016 looked at these feelings of self-stigma in both single men and women, and found that any stigma one might feel about being single decreases as the number of former partners that person has been with romantically increases. However, over time, things change, as people who remain single longer are more depressed and feel more stigma. Also over time, the availability of partners decreases, as older participants reported more romantic rejection at work as they aged.
What are you doing?
I don't know.
You shouldn't do things like that. The man is supposed to do that.
In contrast, having completed higher education and being single by choice were both related to more self-esteem and decreased feeling of stigma. But, as we've seen, the more educated are also less likely to ever find a match. So, as people age, the concerns held by the never married change, coming to accept this as their fate. Piatowski, 2011, conducted extensive interviews with 10 women between the ages of 19 and 43, with a mean age of 25, about their experiences with singleness. She notes that, quote, "The women seemed to be cast under a spell of blind optimism that made them believe no matter what, they would get married because it's just what you do." And her participants were so sure they would get married eventually that some of them even seemed to think the very notion of not marrying was a joke on the part of the researcher. They expressed both societal pressure to marry, because, again, it's just what's done, but also internalized their singleness, viewing it as something wrong with the self, and would view never marrying as a failure. Interestingly, Piatowski's sample expressed a greater fear of never having children than never marrying, indicating that many women may in fact settle, as the New York Post and Kian's research seem to imply, for men who aren't financially their equals because their desire for children eventually outweighs finding an ideal partner.
Oh, don't you worry. Most of you will never fall in love and marry out of fear of dying alone.
Another series of interviews with slightly older Polish men and women with an average age of 33 from Chernenka 2016 examined the rationales given by those who chose not to marry, as fears of infidelity or abandonment, high expectations of others, particularly a desire to not hang out with, in the words of one interviewee, losers, putting off marriage and parenthood till later in life, being dissatisfied with previous cohabitating relationships, feeling unloved in past partnerships, and general difficulties with the opposite sex. As we've seen, putting off marriage, particularly to finish college, only makes women less likely to find a partner who matches up with her expectations and creates a cycle of women wanting to wait for Prince Charming only to find comparatively the only men left when they start looking are the losers that they don't want either.
Those are my top 2 choices for sperm donors. I wanted your medical opinion on genetics.
They're losers.
For this reason, in part potentially, women with some college experience but not complete degrees were among the most likely in Likers data to find a husband, earning, I suppose, a Mrs. degree. In terms of understanding further why people might choose to remain single, we can look to Blakemore, Lawton, and Varanian 2005, who found that generally, women had a significantly greater desire to get married than men did. When it comes to individual factors, for women, valuing career and occupation was negatively related to marriage desire, as was holding more positive attitudes towards other women, while valuing marriage and parenting as a role and having more public self-consciousness was related to a higher drive to marry. Women who had less positive attitudes towards their fellow females, higher evaluations of the importance of being a parent, and a desire to be married were also more likely to want to take their husband's last name. That is, women who are less concerned with marriage are more likely to be concerned with their careers and are more likely to hold feminist or at least more pro-woman attitudes, while women more concerned with marriage are also more concerned with being a parent and conforming to societal norms. Big shocker there, I know, but again, I have to show it with data. I can't just say it's common sense.
Really important to me symbolically that Leslie Knope disappears and becomes Leslie Wyatt. Or Councilwoman Mrs. Ben Wyatt, that's fine too. It's a deal breaker.
Wait, are you messing with
Yeah,
me?
so
All of us, both those who choose to marry or choose to remain single, tend to rationalize our life choices in an attempt likely to reduce cognitive dissonance and to improve our self-concept. We can see this in data from Lauren Kill and Eibach 2013, who found that both single and partnered people tended to view their relationship status as more ideal when they also saw it as more stable. Moreover, as with pretty much anything else in human interaction, group effects and preference have a role to play here, in that people who were single and viewed that single status as stable and long-lasting had more positive opinions towards another person that they were told was also single for the long term, viewing their fellow singlet as happier on Valentine's Day. They were more likely to hire and more willing to work with another single person, and additionally, the researchers found that single participants were even more likely to vote for a mayoral candidate when they were described as stable in their own single status, regardless of whether or not they knew anything about the supposed candidate's positions on policy. Well, that sure explains the mayor of MGTOWN now, doesn't it? Given that there is a sense of solidarity and group cohesion felt amongst the single, it's no surprise why a single woman like Kelly Goff would write an article which not only supports her own life decisions as normative, but also encourages others to join her in her little social group and her series of life choices. One of us, right?
I am also under the iron rule of a woman. Here's $10 for your cause. Your friend, B. Clinton.
As people age, their justifications and rationales for remaining single also change, as some turn to resignation with their status and others come to embrace it as both a personal identity and as a social one. For younger American women aged 18 to 22, assessed by Bei Cheng and Goodkind 2015, the most common rationale for remaining single among affluent undergraduates was enjoying the positives of being able to have an inconsequential relationship. In other words, being a thought.
Be gone!
While in less affluent college students, they reported being most concerned with waiting for financial stability. And in low socioeconomic status, non-students, their primary rationale in staying single was avoiding negative outcomes such as infidelity and drama. In middle-aged, never-married single Canadian women between the ages of 35 and 44, interviewed by Moore and Radke 2015, the researchers reported that overall there was an ongoing struggle to create and maintain a space where being single constitutes normalcy, while at the same time having to answer to normative discourses of womanhood. I really hate using critical cultural language, but there's some interesting stuff there. It means that these women were continually forced to explain to themselves, and occasionally to others, why they were single, and why that single status was legitimate and normal, while often knowing internally that it's considered abnormal, and generally were less happy, healthy, and satisfied with life as we have seen. Looking to even older individuals, Van Winterstein and Manchik Rimmon 2014 conducted a series of interviews with 16 never-married Israeli men and women between 62 and 87 years of age, and found 4 major themes in their reported regrets, fears, and concerns as they aged. 1. Questioning why they chose to remain single, with some reporting being happy that they don't have to care for others or deal with marital strife, but others, such as 62-year-old Yehuda, admitting both a sense of loss and a desire not to wallow in self-pity. 2. Managing loneliness and sadness, typically, in their respondents, by maintaining that they were not lonely and rather filled their lives with friends and family, and getting used to living alone. But as we've seen, friends and family are a poor substitute socially for a romantic partner. 3. A need to take care of the self, in that despite the rationalizations, the interviewees still recognized that without children or a spouse, they were uniquely at risk of health problems and financial issues. And finally, 4, which were dealing with the stereotypes, perceived or otherwise, of being perpetually single, with some participants falsely claiming that they had been divorced in the past simply to keep up appearances, others expressing shame and even guilt, and still others feeling a sense of pride. Despite these claims, though, we know statistically that these people in general are less happy, less satisfied, and tend to have poorer health, both mentally and physically, and are also just more likely to die younger than those who have a spouse. Thus, these are for the most part not realities, but rather justifications for their own decisions and life circumstances. It's not actual greater well-being being produced from their single status. There is no joy in living and dying alone. And interestingly, it seems to be the women, such as 65-year-old Nahama, who were more likely to engage in these self-justifications than men.
Why I need a man to tell me put on my wallpaper? I'm an independent woman. Okay, Miss T. You see how she act like she don't want one?
Thus again, we see attempts to normalize, to rationalize life choices, to reduce the internalized self-stigma, and to simply put on a happy face and pretend one is happy, when in aggregate, it's unlikely. So with all of this in mind, let's come to some conclusions. What we can take away from all of this is that women are more likely now than ever to be single and to remain never married, in a large part because they want to avoid hooking up with so-called losers, and instead are looking to marry up, to marry a man who makes more and is ideally more educated. However, given that women now earn more and make more than they did in the past, there are simply fewer men statistically who fit those criteria, particularly as women age and men marry off. The result is a growing number of never married people, and as such, more people who are forced to explain their own life decisions as normal and rational, rather than a personal failure. Ultimately, the results of women's liberation and an increase in gender parity is a greater than ever disparity between the sexes, with both women and men struggling to find a partner, predominantly because it's become more difficult for men to meet women's expectations, as women's own capacity to earn and attain higher education has blossomed. As a result, many women are forced to deny the stigma and explain why they aren't actually lonely, when we know they're less happy, they're less satisfied, they're less healthy, they're more likely to die young, and generally, they're just less well off in almost every imaginable dimension of well-being. So, is there joy in living and dying alone? As I said in the beginning, no. There is no clear evidence, there's no evidence at all that there is anything better about being single than being married in any major capacity, at least in aggregate. Sure, postmenopausal women who are unmarried are a bit thinner, a bit healthier, but they still die earlier, and they usually die in decreased economically stable environments without the benefits of happiness and life satisfaction that marriage and children provide. Fundamentally, this Guardian article is at best negligent and at worst actively hazardous to spread such disinformation about the value that marriage presents for total well-being. This article is merely an expression of Kelly Goff's own social identity as a single person, seeing that single status as a source of pride when we know this pride is mostly a manifestation of internalized stigmatization and an attempt to explain away the many regrets so often reported by never married women as normative while knowing logically and reasonably that it is not normative. This is a display of justification for her own actions and behaviors, not an expression of scientific data. It is a cry for help, not a declaration of joy. For there is no joy, Kelly, in living nor dying alone, at least not from a statistical standpoint. The data do not support your hypothesis. To paraphrase Aristotle, there are only two types of folk who can live alone: beasts and gods.
It's like who died and left Aristotle in charge of ethics?
Obviously, I hold no ill will towards Kelly. I actually find this just sad. But this kind of reporting is potentially deleterious to society, for as we've seen, people who are depressed due to their single status, particularly young women, as they age and become incapable of having offspring of their own, and incapable of finding a man who meets their standards, often feel they have no choice other than to, well, check out of the system. This message is dangerous, and it's why I felt the need to respond to it. But what do you guys think? Do you think that marriage really does produce greater happiness and life satisfaction, or are we just missing some of the variables in explaining these average discrepancies? Do you think it's possible for some or even many people to find joy in living and dying alone? Have you experienced increased satisfaction, happiness, and health benefits while being in a committed relationship? Let me know what you guys think about this topic in the comments below. I love reading what you guys have to say. As always, an enormous thank you to all of my wonderful and awesome supporters on Patreon, Subscribestar, and Streamlabs. Thank you guys so much. Without your support, I wouldn't be able to do this kind of spedentry full time. Once again, references to all of the studies I have cited here in this video will be linked in the description box, so check that out if you'd like to learn more. As I mentioned earlier, you can get 75% off a 3-year plan with Nord VPN by clicking the link also in that description. And if you particularly like my stuff, you can check out the merch store as well. Finally, if you like this video, consider leaving it a thumbs up. And if you're not subscribed, consider subscribing and clicking that bell button because people don't get notifications for my videos anymore. Thank you guys so much for watching through this long and data-heavy video. And as always, dear friends, Altana Volt.